Good day, everybody. It is Calxiyn here, and if you guys enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe for more RWBY videos. This video was brought to you by my patrons over on Patreon and my YouTube membership members, so thank you to them for supporting the channel. Today, we are going to be talking about the RWBY fairy tale book, again, specifically The Girl in the Tower, which is an extension of Salem's story from the Lost Fable. It's going to be super fun. We're going to talk about this, like, basically a little bit of a extra spicy lore dump, and then I'm also going to analyze it from the perspective of RWBY, but also just from the perspective of fairy tale conventions in our world, and so it's gonna be really fun, and I hope that you guys enjoy. Now, you guys love to ask me if the fairy tales in the book are true. I would say that this one probably is. I think that this is probably the story that was sort of being circulated at the time after Ozma had saved Salem, because we have to remember that Ozma was already sort of hailed as a great hero, so after saving Salem, it was probably like, ooh, like a brand new Ozma story to spread around and all that stuff, and then Salem and Ozma just sort of passed it on in the New World as well when they were trying to convince everyone that they were gods and stuff. Maybe they, told that story as how they met and stuff like that. So I definitely think that this version is true. Now, it does end with happily ever after, and we know that that didn't happen, but my sort of inclination is that this is almost like what Ozma would have told, you know what I mean? Even though a lot of it is from Salem's perspective, about Salem's life, he would have sort of been saying, and we lived happily ever after, and then Ozma died, but it happened before Ozma died. You guys understand what I'm saying? So at the start of the story, we have a long time ago in a land far away, and you guys have probably heard that before, and then at the end of the story, we have, and they lived happily ever after. And both of those things are very standard for fairy tales, but I want to sort of analyze, like, both of those aspects, like, why use those? And so the very first thing that I sort of want to talk about is far away was basically used like in our fairy tales, like our real world fairy tales, just to sort of, suspension of disbelief, I guess you could say, right? Like, if you're telling this story, like, in a village or, like, two little kids or something, you want to be able to be like, oh, yeah, this happened in a land far away. Like, we don't have giants and fairy godmothers here, but maybe they do in France. I'm specifically thinking of something like Beauty and the Beast and, like, Cinderella and stuff like that, right? And so it's just that suspension of disbelief that, if you're in England or something and you're telling the story, it's like, oh, yeah, that could have happened in France. That makes sense, right? And then they lived happily ever after is just sort of one of those things where it's like, yeah, obviously, you want to live happily ever after. You want the characters to live happily ever after. That's all that anybody wants, right? That's a very standard thing to add as well. Now, in terms of, like, this being included in this specific fairy tale, I would say that E.C. Myers is, like, fucking around with us. You know what I mean? It's supposed to be some playful irony. It's supposed to be cheeky, right? Like, when you think of a long time ago, in a land far away, it's sort of this double thing where it was literally hundreds of thousands of years ago, or just thousands of years, whatever, and it was, a very far away, like this distant, basically another planet, you know what I mean? Like, obviously Remnant is the same planet, but this story took place, like, from a different, like, civilization, you know what I mean? Like, a different, like, group of people that have just been, like, wiped out for thousands of years, So, like, far away, it's definitely, like, the world that they lived in with magic and gods and all this stuff is worlds away from the Remnant that now exists, right? And so I think that that's really cool, and then happily ever after is obviously, like, they didn't, right? They didn't live happily ever after, so that is that on that. What's also interesting is that this story starts with, consider this story's moral and take it to heart as I have. Do what you can for others because you are able, which I think is super interesting because, again, I feel like that this points that the story was sort of told by Ozma in some capacity, right? Because Ozma is described as this good-hearted person who just wanted to save Salem to save her, right? And the tale ends with happily ever after, so honestly, I could see, like, Ozma and Salem are, hanging out in a city or something, and everyone wants to know, like, Ozma, how did you save her? And then they tell this whole story, and then at the end, like, Ozma and Salem, like, they grab each other's hands and they're like, and they lived happily ever after, and they're just looking, like, lovingly in each other's eyes, and this was before Ozma actually died and everything went to shit. You know what I mean? That this was the story that Ozma and Salem would tell other people if they asked, and that story just sort of came with them in the New World. So let's talk about the Salem lore. We actually get a lot more information about her father than we do in the Lost Fable, and it's actually revealed that he was an alright guy. He was was much like Ozma. He went around and saved people. He brought wicked men to justice. He killed some beasts. He had some powerful magic, and he saved a princess, and that princess was Salem's mom. And so then he became a lord. He got some money. He was hailed a mighty hero. You know, it was all going very good for him. So in the Lost Fable, we just hear that he's a cruel lord, but here it actually says that he started out, you know, as a pretty good-hearted guy, much like Ozma. Salem's mom becomes pregnant, and she dies giving birth to her, and then her father locks her in the highest tower of the castle, and the nannies are the only people that can go in and out, and the father does visit sometime, but he won't even hold her, which is all very, you know, it's sad, obviously. There's some toxic grieving going on here, like her father won't let her out of the tower because he can't bear to lose her like he lost his wife, and it's understandable for a father to be overprotective like that, but the problem is that his needs are starting to outweigh sort of the needs and the autonomy of his daughter, for his daughter to be able to be a person, and she's sort of like an object just kept by him, and we'll get into that later. And so there's a lot of things to unpack here. First, the childbirth thing. A lot of moms especially die in fairy tales, and like people have been like, oh yeah, Disney always kills the moms, but it actually goes past Disney. Like, you guys have to understand, this is what we learned in class anyway, is that the mortality rate for women giving birth back then was just not great, right? And so, you know, you have all these fairy tales where the mom dies giving birth or the mom dies, like, yeah, like that's because that's just what happened. And that's sort of where, like, oh, the stepsister thing came in, and, like, the stepmother and all that stuff, because people back then, especially, like, poorer people, they would just remarry, you know what I mean? Because it was sort of like a survival, thing, you know, like, a father, like, would need, you know, more heirs to, like, help out on the farm and all that stuff, so he can't just, like, stop after, like, his wife dies. He has to remarry and get another wife, and the cycle sort of starts all over again. So that's where you get a lot of, like, the step-parent sort of situation. Obviously, here, like, he never remarries or anything, but that's what I sort of think of, like, seeing, like, oh yeah, she died in childbirth. Like, that's a very regular fairy tale convention, especially just because of that. This whole thing actually reminds me of The Little Mermaid, which may seem kind of weird to you guys, because you guys probably thought, oh, she'll compare it to Rapunzel, girl in the tower, duh. No. And so it's very interesting, because in The Little Mermaid prequel, we basically find out that Triton's wife was killed by humans. She was basically, like, harpooned and stuff like that. It's, like, very not nice. And that's why he's so strict about everything. He doesn't want any of his children going to the surface and all of that stuff because, you know, like, that's how his wife died, and so it's an understandable grief. But then you see Triton's character arc in The Little Mermaid, like, he was being a harmful parent, and then he sort of grows out of being a harmful parent. I actually do want to make a video about that, but you guys will just have to take my word for it for now. But that is basically Triton's character arc in the movie, is that he has some very harmful parenting behaviors, and then by the end of the movie, he acknowledges he was wrong and gives Ariel her freedom and all that stuff. And, like, a lot of people sort of have this, oh, Ariel's just a stupid kid, or, like, Triton is abusive and all that stuff. Like, it's very, like, polarizing, but I promise you, like, there's something in the middle there where both characters accept their faults. But anyway, we'll talk about that another time. Salem gets a lot of hairpins and dresses and dolls from her father, and that's sort of the next thing that happens. And this happens in, I don't know, like, there's not really, like, old type of fairy tales that I've heard this about, just because a lot of, like, old fairy tales sort of revolved around poor people, and so it didn't really, like, you know, like, there are some fairy tales about, like, princesses living it up, you know what I mean, and getting a bunch of these dresses, but usually it's poor people that turn into rich people, and then they buy all the dresses and stuff like that. But Salem is starting out rich, so that's a little bit different. I can't really think of anything, but it just reminds me of those movies or whatever, where, like, the parent is obviously trying to buy the child's love and complacency with, like, material objects. But yeah, I can't think of a specific thing right now. I don't think a lot of Disney movies have done that specific thing. You know, like, I guess other than maybe Mother Gothel and Rapunzel a little bit, just because, you know, she sort of, I made your favorite soup, I'm gonna bring you some paint so you never leave. Like, sort of, you know, to get her to be complacent and stay here, she sort of gives all these gifts to Rapunzel, but it's nothing like hairpins and all that stuff. It's very, like, paint from this flower and, you know, stuff like that. What Salem's father actually does remind me of, and this is gonna be, like, so obscure for some of you guys, but it actually reminds me of how Hades is portrayed in the Hadestown musical, and I am gonna be referencing Hadestown a couple times, so I'll just briefly explain what it is. But it is a retelling of Hades and Persephone, but also Eurydice and Orpheus, like those Greek myths, and it's sort of a steampunk post-depression, like Hades is like underworld is a bunch of like warehouses and factories and stuff like that, so it's very like that. And so Hades basically says, take it from a man no longer young. If you want to hold a woman's son, hang a chain around her throat made of many karat gold, shackle her from wrist to wrist with sterling silver bracelets, fill her pockets full of stones, precious ones, diamonds, bind her with a golden band, take it from an old man. So this is him talking to Orpheus about how to keep a woman, basically. And so obviously that's directed at his wife. He's talking about Persephone. But I feel like Salem's father is basically doing the same thing with his daughter. He is shackling her with precious stones, as the song says, right? With dresses and hairpins and brushes and dolls and all this sort of stuff. And there's a line in the musical where Hades says he wants Persephone to think of the high walls as a gilded cage, right? And so obviously gilded means like, you know what I mean? Like almost like sparkly and all that stuff, like a bejeweled, almost like a bejeweled cage in a sense, right? To keep her safe, right? And to think of it as his embrace. Like the walls are supposed to be his embrace around Persephone to keep her safe. And I feel like that mindset is a lot like Salem's father and how Salem's father feels about the tower. We're gonna talk more about Salem's father's mindset later, but Salem discovers that even though there's a window in her room, no one can come in and she can't go out. But stuff that she throws out the window apparently go out the window just fine, which is kind of funny. And it's also noted that the nanny starts to bring her books to read, and so Salem starts to dream about these fairy tales coming to life, about her prince coming to save her, which is something that we've seen in fairy tales sometimes, how this story is sort of meta, in a sense, like Shrek is sort of meta too with the fairy tale conventions, but in specifically the musical, I can't remember if the Shrek the movie did this, but Fiona is reading these stories about like, oh, you know, like Rapunzel gets her prince and Snow White gets her prince. Why the fuck can't I get my prince, bro? You know what I mean? Like she has a song that's sort of all about that. So yeah, that's what that personally reminded me of, is that, you know, those sort of fairy tales that are sort of more meta, where the princess is actually considering like other princesses and the other like happily ever afters in the books that they've read. Beauty and the Beast does this too though, because like Belle is reading a book and it's like, see, like she found her Prince Charming, right? And so it's not just like the meta ones like Shrek, like other fairy tales and other like, especially Disney princesses read about the fairy tales that they also are going to be in. In terms of the nanny dynamic, because that's been like a thing, I don't know what to call it. I guess it's a genre convention, but not specifically of fairy tales, like more of fantasy, because like I already said, right, like I can't think of a fairy tale that specifically had a nanny in it. Like newer ones, yes, but not those sort of old ones like Cinderella and like Jack and the Beanstalk that I keep talking about and that I specifically learned about in class, right? Or like Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, just stuff like that. I mean, Sleeping Beauty has the fairies, but I don't remember if that's like a Disney edition or if she had the fairies in the written one. I don't know. But you know what I mean? Like, we have a cruel lord caring nanny dynamic, and that happens a lot, like, in more so fantasy stuff. And I can actually think of, like, a webtoon that's done that. Like, you know, their daughter had, like, this caring nanny, and the lord actually, like, killed her because, like, the nanny, I guess, I don't know, like, encouraged too much goodness in her heart or something like that. Like, it was very, very sad. But yeah, like, the nanny thing is more of, like, a recent fantasy thing. Like, you have the parents that sort of ignore the child, and then you have the nanny that, like, cultivates the child, and usually something very shitty happens to the nanny. But anyway, now the father basically becomes twisted with power at this point. Like, he was overprotective, but now he's just, like, money hungry. He starts to cut the salaries of the people in the castle. He taxes the people on the land more, and, like, he replaces half of his staff with soldiers because he's so afraid to lose what he has and what he's sort of cultivated. And so he just goes a little bit crazy, like, just like keeping Salem in the tower, he wants to keep more money and just more things because he thinks that that's gonna help. And so, again, let's talk about Hades Town, because there are so many Hades Town things to unpack here, right? Orpheus basically calls out Hades at one point and talks about how Hades has grown paranoid, that he keeps all the wealth in Hades Town, or like basically no one else would be here in a sense. He needs to keep all the people trapped, he needs to keep all the wealth here, or they may not come back, you know? And they also sort of say like he needs the empire itself to keep Persephone here because he's not confident enough that Persephone would come back every year if she wasn't trapped, if that sort of makes sense. And so Orpheus says that he's lost his heart, he's grown Salem's so afraid that he'll lose what he owns, but what he doesn't know is what he's defending is already gone. And so the same thing that happened with Hades has basically happened with the king right here. And obviously the thing that Orpheus is referring to in terms of defending is Persephone's love. Like, Hades basically thinks, if I don't have all this wealth, if I don't have all this stuff, if I don't have all these power plants and neon lights or whatever's going on in Hades town, like, Persephone will not come back and I will not retain her love. But it's those very things that are causing Persephone to not love him anymore, which we hear about in the musical. So the same thing is happening with Salem. And so on Salem's 16th birthday, it's a full moon or something, I don't know, I feel like it was, I didn't write that down, so like, don't quote me on that, maybe it's not. The moon's not important anyway. But basically, it's sad to note here, like, they have seemed to have these talks about freedom before, because Salem basically says, like, talk of freedom would make him angry and violent, and so I wonder if that's supposed to imply that he's been violent towards her, because they have this brief conversation, like, Salem's like, why are you making me, like, a prisoner here? And all that sort of stuff, things that I mentioned before, and the Lord's like, you're not a prisoner, like, you're my daughter, like, you're treating me like when I'm only doing it to keep you safe, like, you know, that sort of back and forth. And so Salem sort of shuts it down because she knows that talk of freedom would make him angry and violent. So again, I'm like, does that mean violent towards her, violent towards her nannies? Like, there's, like, some implications of actual physical abuse there, which is kind of, So Salem thinks of a plan, and basically she's like, hey, I got enough dresses, and if you won't give me freedom, give me pens and paper so I can write some stories, because I love reading and stuff like that. And, you know, her father's like, yeah, what harm could that do? A lot, because basically what she does is that she writes this, you know, warrant, basically, like, whoever defeats the Lord can get the riches in the castle, and all that stuff, and she tosses a bunch of these, like, to the wind, out the window, so they, like, I guess they fly around and, like, people get a hold of it, and it's like, you see this shit? If we kill him, and right, like, people aren't liking him either. That's the other thing, is that people aren't liking the Lord right now. Like, he's replaced half his staff, he's taxing the people, and so the people are probably like, if we kill him, we get the money, like, let's kill him and split the money, you know what I'm saying? And so I feel like that's probably what happened, and she basically writes her way out, and that's a very, like, Hamilton, you know, sort of reference. Like, he always says, like, I wrote my way out, like, he writes his way out of poverty, he writes his way out of trouble, all that stuff, and so Salem, like, literally writes her way out of the tower. And now we have self-fulfilling prophecy time, which is my favorite thing. The Lord is so afraid that he would be attacked by people. This is what it says in the story. He is so afraid that he would be attacked by people trying to get his riches. And Salem literally created that nightmare, right? And so you have to wonder, like, if he gave Salem freedom from childhood, would his worst fears have ever come true? And I would say no, it's his paranoia that created this self-fulfilling prophecy, and that wouldn't have happened otherwise, you know what I mean? And so it's just sort of, I don't know, it's just sort of funny how that turns out. Now in fairy tales, we've seen self-fulfilling prophecies sometime, but I say that that's more of, like, again, a fantasy, like, genre convention, if that makes sense, like, much like the nanny thing. This is a sort of, like, later on, you know, like, thing that people started doing, like, the self-fulfilling prophecy stuff. And so, yeah, like, the Lord basically created his own nightmare because, you know, Salem basically created his own nightmare. And so you also have to think about if that's some foreshadowing too. Like, Salem created the nightmare of her father, and then she goes on to create nightmares for the rest of her days. Right? And so Salem's rescue is also fleshed out a bit more. Like, they explain, like, a lot of people died, right? A lot of people died trying to save Salem, but then Ozma came in, right? And so that's great. And so she also explains, like, that she was, you know, locked in magically by her father's magic. And that answers a lot of people's questions, because a lot of people are like, why didn't Salem bust herself out? Like, you know, all that sort of stuff. I think that's, like, a little, I don't know, that's a little victim blamey. It's like, why wouldn't Weiss just do this or that? Like, all these years, you know? Like, it's sort of one of those things where I'm just like, no, like, shut up. Like, I get why people are asking, because, like, Ozma just comes through the door and it seems so easy, but you have to keep in mind, like, the whole thing was that, like, the window was magic, the door was magic, like, everything was basically, like, magicked in some way, and she was, like, literally locked in and all that stuff. And even if she did get out, right? Like, say that the door was just unlocked one day, she would still have to fight her father, and her father was this powerful sorcerer, and she doesn't have that much combat experience, right? Like, she could play with her magic in her room and all that stuff, but, like, her father's a warrior, right? So it makes sense that, like, her and Ozma could take him, you know what I mean? Like, Ozma came to fight him, and Ozma, like, did okay, but, like, in this case, right, her and Ozma could have probably taken him on, whereas she by herself, probably not. But yeah, Ozma killed him, and like, again, he killed multiple people. Like, this lord killed like a bunch of people before Ozma like took him down, right? You know. There's also some added dialogue here, which I think is really special because we haven't gotten to hear it before. And so Salem basically says, this castle and all these lands are yours now. The hero shook his head. I only came to right a terrible wrong and strike down an evil tyrant. All you needed was a little help, but in the end you freed yourself. And I was like, oh, like that was so nice, because it's true. Like, Salem did free herself, right, when you really think about it. She was clever enough to free herself. And so I like this. The girl was surprised to have met a hero right from the pages of a fairy tale. The hero was surprised to meet a girl smart and powerful enough who shared his curiosity about the world and a strong sense of justice. Neither was eager to go their separate ways, and they lived happily ever after. And so now we know that isn't true. Ozpin's notes basically talk about this as metafiction, which is true in a sense. Like, it references reading fairy tales, which again, most fairy tales don't really do unless they're the more newer ones, like I already mentioned, like Shrek does that. Even Beauty and the Beast. Beauty and the Beast does that. We'll give Beauty and the Beast that. But I'm talking about the old ones. I don't think that the fairy tale thing was a function in the actual fairy tale. You know what I mean? Like, just the Disney movie. You know, like, she writes herself out of danger, which is also really cool, as well. So what's interesting here is that Ozpin brings up some good points about Salem's character, and for her own freedom, she basically doomed a bunch of people to die. So here's the thing, right? I actually disagree with Ozpin's notes here, because Ozpin is sort of like, you know, she doomed so many people to die. Maybe that was like something in his relationship he realized later and all that stuff, but like, those people knew what they were getting into. You know what I mean? They were promised riches and they were promised a castle. You gotta be willing to sacrifice a couple things if you're gonna get big money. You know what I mean? Nothing comes for free, and so I kind of actually disagree with Ozpin's note on that Salem doomed these people to die, because she really didn't. She put out a job. If you complete the job, you get the money. They didn't complete the job, and so it's like, I don't know, it seems like a pretty fair contract to me. If someone was like, okay, Cal, you have to fight, like, I don't know, you have to fight Dwayne The Rock Johnson or something. I don't know, like, anything, guys, do not come for me. You have to fight this man, okay? And if you win, you get $1 billion, not $1 million. Like, you get riches that'll last you, like, forever, and for your children's children. Like, you will get, like, a shit ton of stuff. But you need to fight him, and you need to beat him. Like, that's not my fault if I try to go for that because I want the money, okay? Even though like, guys, like, no, it's not happening, you know what I mean? And so I'm just saying that, like, those people that took Salem's job offer, they knew what they were getting into. Like, let's not, I don't blame Salem for that, right? And I think that the great thing about Salem is that you can see her side of the argument, like, even in the show, and they incorporated that in the fairy tale really well. And, like, now we get a deeper look at this story, and Salem is more sympathetic than before, but even in the notes, we sort of have this very, like, you know, like, okay, did she doom them to their death? Was that okay? You know, like, what are you willing to do for your own freedom? But then, you know, you got people killed. Like, you have this sort of debate, but I feel like that's a great thing about Salem, is that there's so many debates around her, literally all the time, like, by the fandom, and there's no clear-cut answer, because, again, like, Ozma was the only thing that she had in this world after being, like, isolated and abused by her father. She could literally see only two people, like, the nanny and her father, right? There are lots of cases of children, like real-life children, being kept inside, like, a room or, like, a basement all their lives, and they're freed at, like, 16 by the authorities, and they aren't doing the best mentally, right? And so, like, honestly, I feel really bad for Salem. Like, what could you expect? You know? And so, yeah, that's how I kind of feel about Salem. It's like, she went through something unimaginable, and the mental trauma from that would literally be, like, unfathomable by most of us, right? And so, yeah, that's interesting that the story did all this. And so that's all from me. I hope that you guys enjoyed me talking about Salem's story, all that sort of stuff, and I will see you next time. Bye!